unless, unless you've had your head in the sand for goodness knows how long, you might have noticed we've got some staff shortages pretty much everywhere, quite frankly. Now, there's been some solutions as to how we fix it. Don't worry, it's not returning back into the EU, so you can breathe easy. Instead, it's to look to places like prisons and get those guys out and about, particularly in places like the fields, for example, get them picking fruit. William, is that the answer to our shortages of staff in this country? Get the prisoners to do it?
Well, I think there are probably some underlying problems we sort first by getting the immigration system sorted so that people can come to this country if they're going to do a decent job.
Yeah, but that's going to take a long time. I'm talking about a here and now.
Yeah, and for the few thousand prisoners in open prisons who we can rely upon to conduct themselves safely and fairly, then that's probably not a bad idea as long as they're employed in a reasonable way and it's not, forced labour for nothing. But I think I would be very, very reticent to start having people who are serving longer-term sentences go out into the community and undertake work. Because actually, for me, prison isn't a holiday camp. It's to remove dangerous people from the streets and society and keep us safe. And I have to say, sometimes the rehabilitation movement goes an awfully long way too far, in my view. So if someone is not a threat to society, then fine. But if they're in for a long time, which is what some people advocate, then I don't want them anywhere near families and people living out in the community.
So subject to a risk assessment, you wouldn't be opposed to it. And you think that these people should be paid?
God, no, I wouldn't dream of enforcing a risk assessment on anyone, let alone a prisoner. But I think people who are in open prisons are already categorised as reasonably safe. But if they are going to work, then they should be paid a fair wage, because...
What's a fair wage?
Well, I think it'd be reasonable for them to be employed on the same terms as anyone else in society. I mean, if you are going to try and bring them into the community by giving them a job, then it's only fair that they get a reasonable idea of that. There is a number of restaurants who employ prisoners to produce food and to learn a trade and a skill. Now, I'm all for that, but I would first of all like our education system to be good enough to give people who aren't prisoners those life chances as well. And I very much worry that a few thousand people are getting a better set of life chances than most people out working in a normal way.
So they should get normal wage, i.e. minimum wage and above and all the rest of it. What about the fact that they get their board and lodgings paid for?
Well, perhaps we can find... Yeah, I think so. That's a good idea.
Oh, good. Thank you. Paul, your thoughts?
I think potentially it's a good way of reintegrating people into society, giving them, the work ethic, the skills that will be necessary to them when they're eventually released. I agree they should be paid for it. If you're going to have a situation where private companies are going to use the advantage of prison labour, and that could mean, by the way, private companies setting up workshops within the prison space itself,
yes,
rather than prisoners always going beyond the walls of the prison. But if private companies are going to get the benefit of that labour, then absolutely the prisoners should be paid. I think they should be given workers' rights in the way that anybody else would be. Pay tax, pay national insurance, pay pension contributions and all the rest of it. And you never know, some of them might then, when they're released, stay in that job, have the opportunity of continuing in that job once they're actually released. What you can't have is a situation, I think, where private companies exploit that labour. Because not only would it be unfair on the individuals themselves.
Exploit it how?
Well, by not paying them, for example, and just saying, look, we want your labour, but we're not going to pay you, or we're not going to pay you a decent rate. Because not only would that be unfair on the individuals themselves. What about if you make a contribution
to the institution of the prison as opposed to the individuals?
Well, look, I mean, it needs to be fair. Whatever the solution is, it needs to be a fair one for the individual. I think we need to stand against the principle that private companies can set up inside prisons and exploit cheap labour, essentially, and not pay people any wages. Because not only would it be unfair to those individuals, but it would also give those private companies the opportunity to hold down wages for their normal employees, for their non-prison employees. If you suddenly have as an employer, a much greater, let's say, a reserve army of labour available to you, and you're not paying anything for that, or you're only paying a pittance for it, then it allows you to hold down wages for your normal employees. Because whenever wage demands come in, you just say, well, why should I give you that? Because I've got all these people who are prepared to pay.
Well, you've read the mind of one of my viewers, Ivor, because literally the second that you said it, he was emailing in as well saying, what about setting up factories within prisons, Michelle? That would give us an economic output, but it would also, to your point, keep people safe. Win-win, says Ivor. Andy said, yes, we should get prisoners to go to work, and they could start by repairing all the potholes in Britain's roads. Someone wrote in about potholes just yesterday and asked me to do an entire debate on them, for that matter. Sally says, I think it's a great idea for prisoners to be used for labour, especially for picking crops, but they should not be paid for it. It costs the taxpayer a fortune to keep them inside, so this would be their way at basically paying the cost back to the country.
The punishment for the prisoner is having your liberty taken away. That is the punishment. You don't have your freedom, you don't have your liberty. It would be an extra punishment, in my view, to say, oh, by the way, you're going to work a 42-hour week and we're not going to pay you for it. You're going to be doing manual labour, we're not going to pay you. I think that would be an addition. It'd be an addition to the sentencing that prisoner received in a court of law from a judge. So, you know, if you're going to ask them to work, then you've got to pay them.
Your viewer makes an excellent point. What I say people should be paid to work like a normal job, when it comes to giving back to the community that they have violated through their criminality, I'm all for having people be required to do things like paint over graffiti or fill in potholes. That absolutely should be happening. There's no reason why, if someone gets a custodial sentence, they shouldn't also be given mandatory community volunteering work to do. So if they're in an open prison, I'm all for using them to sort out the bits and bobs that need doing in the local community in a safe way. And I don't think they should be paid a penny for that, because if they have gone and violated the community's ability to feel safe, then they should make recompense for that. But when it comes to actual work, i.e. competing with the people out in the world, then fair enough, we need to do the things that Paul's talking about.
I think there's a lot of advantages to this, isn't there? I mean, not least the obvious one to the economy, but also, to your point, to the individuals, because at the end of the day, you know, if someone is a wrong 'un and they're in prison for whatever it is that they've done, you want to try and break that cycle, don't you? So they don't just come out within 5 seconds, they do something wrong again and get back in. So if you can break it,
and I think we're pretty rubbish at it at the moment. Actually, when you look at prisoners, most of them, you know, don't work. I think work is quite sporadic in prisons. People are generally paid a pittance. There doesn't seem to be much of a work ethic because of that, because there isn't any reward in labour given to them. But if you actually give them a proper job, as I say, pay tax, national insurance, you give them that work ethic, it would be a really favourable way of reintegrating.
You're focusing a lot on the rights of the prisoner. What about the rights of the victim?
Yes.
Prison is not just there to give people chances when they get out. It's also there to punish and to keep communities safe. So I would like to see more of a focus on people having to have the time sat in a cell thinking about what they've done, thinking about the harm they've caused. And I'm very concerned when we come into these kinds of debates, people spend an awful lot of time thinking about what the prisoner's going to do when they leave, not what the victim's going through whilst that person's in jail.
I completely agree. I mean, I'm certainly not someone... I'm not a liberal when it comes to prison policy, I can assure you of that. But at the same time, I think it's reasonable to say, look, if you can find a way of reintegrating people back into society by giving them rewarding work, and it's not as if you know you're giving them some sort of huge bonus. You're giving them pay, yes, but they've got to work for it, as they will do when they're released. I don't think those two positions are incompatible. Tough prison policy, but give people opportunities for when they come out.